Time. Awesome. Thank you, Phil, for that introduction. Thank you, Josh, and the team for having me here. And hi, my name's Jack. As Phil said, I work at Google currently, where I work on the Chrome DevTools, particularly currently focusing on the performance panel, which hopefully some of you have come across and used. I have, as an aside, I have a bunch of DevTools related stickers in my bag. I'd love you to come up to me later, talk to me about DevTools, what's missing, what we could do better. I'd love to just hear any feedback. But I'm not here to talk about DevTools today. I'm here to talk about the web, the abstractions, complexities, and what I think is a slight imbalance in how we have pushed the web into a very JavaScript-heavy ecosystem. I'm going to talk today about what we can do to address that balance. I think some of us, especially when I learned to build websites, I kind of yearn for this nostalgia of the past. I can remember the first website I built for the Falmouth Rangers under-13s football team. I played in the team. I was also the captain of the team, not to brag too much. My dad was also the coach of the team. I don't know if that had anything to do with me being the captain of the team. Certainly, the other players on the team really felt that my dad had played an overdue role in giving me the captaincy. He stresses he didn't, but I never really lived that one down. But when I was learning to write HTML and build the website, it was just such a simple setup. I wrote some code. That code got run in a browser, and then the user looked at the website I built. It wasn't a very good website, and the code wasn't very good either. I wrote it all in Notepad. Yeah. I didn't indent a single line of HTML. I don't think at that point I knew you could have code in different files, so my CSS was in there as well. I had no syntax highlighting, obviously. But it was just such a nice way to learn how to code. I didn't really appreciate that at the time, but looking back and having spent time teaching people JavaScript and the web generally, the fact that you could just load up Notepad, hit save, refresh the browser, and be there was really cool. And it's still a great way for people to get on board with the web now. As we know, things on the web today are a little bit different. They're a little bit more complex. And I'm not here to say that we should go to work tomorrow, rip out all the JavaScript, uninstall VS Code, and revert back to unindented, plain black text in Notepad. That might be a step too far, but I think we can maybe pull back into the middle at some point. Before I talk about that, I want to talk a bit about how I think we've got to this position and what has influenced that. I can remember when Node.js first popped onto the scene, and suddenly we could write JavaScript to build server-side applications. I started out as a Ruby developer building Ruby on Rails apps. Sorry, Amy. But it was very exciting that we could use JavaScript to do this. As part of that, JavaScript suddenly got this whole world of tooling that hadn't really existed before. The first time I used npm to install a dependency, in this case Lodash, and then require it, it was magical that I could just reach this thing, it was magically installed, and I could just begin using it as I wanted to. And as front-end developers, I think we looked at people who are doing this every day, and we thought, that looks really nice. I'd like to have some of that. I remember the days of copying URLs to scripts and putting like window.jquery equals jQuery, that kind of stuff. Managing dependencies by just pasting chunks of code into script tags. It wasn't too nice, and obviously there were a lot of pitfalls. So once we saw that this world existed in Node and on the server side, tools sprung up to help us adopt this onto the front end. I don't think this particular tool needs any introduction. This is Webpack. I can't remember when it first popped up. What it did when it came along is it promised this world of being able to install from npm and magically, without us knowing how, made those dependencies work in the browser for us. Suddenly, as front-end developers, we had this whole world of code that we didn't have access to before at our fingertips, and we could embrace it and use it to build our websites, which we did. Now, Webpack has a slightly off reputation, so we say, particularly these days as we think about how much JavaScript has taken over the web. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that Webpack did a lot of good for us as well. It really pushed forwards us using JavaScript. It really was influential in tools like Babel, however you want to say it. That let us experiment with things like ECMAScript 6 and new JavaScript features that we could use even though all the browsers hadn't implemented them. Sure, I'm going to talk in a bit about how I think we went too far into that, but it's important to note that I think tools like this really did play a big part in pushing the language forward into what it has become today. But we had all this code accessible to us at our fingertips, and that came at a cost. This has been a theme throughout the conference, actually, so it's great that I can keep on going. But I think sort of accidentally over time, we started really focusing on the developer experience ahead of the user experience. And to be honest, I don't think this was on purpose. I just think it was a lot of fun to build websites in this way, install things and start working with them. But it's pushed us to some distance between us and the users. And I'll let you decide if we're the Lego chap on your left or if we're the dinosaurs on the right. I'm not quite sure. But as a front-end developer, I could install something, use it, run a build script via Webpack or a similar tool. And it was so easy, and it was so enjoyable, and it was so productive. But they had no visible cost. So when we did this, and as a developer at my machine, it all worked seamlessly. But I didn't see the cost that was happening. I didn't see the files being installed. I saw a little npm spinner, and then suddenly everything worked. Now, for people who were doing this in Node.js and working on the server side, this wasn't an issue. There was a cost associated, but their server and their web application on the back end would pay the cost. But in a front-end world, as we know, that's not the case. The cost of these dependencies is really heavily pushed onto the user. The bandwidth required to send that code to the user's device, the time taken for the browser to read and understand the code, and finally, the time taken for that code to execute and run. We as the developers don't pay that. We ask every single one of our users to. And for some applications on the web, this actually worked fine, and this is justifiable. I was in a UX workshop at work last week where we were using Figma to sketch designs and sort of give feedback. And Figma, at least, I don't use it every day as I'm more on the engineering side, but I was amazed that Figma is actually a web application. On sort of below all the niceties, it is a HTML canvas element that Figma then builds on top of. And to me, it's pretty mind-blowing that the web now can do things like that. We've also seen Adobe release a version of Photoshop for the web. And that's amazing. And when we get to the stage of building applications like that, we accept that there probably is going to be a lot of code involved, and tools like this can really help us. But as Jason puts it in this blog post, most of us aren't making Figma. Most of us are still making documents. Now, if we think of the web as a big sliding scale, we have Figma on one side, and we have Jack's Falmouth Rangers under 13 match results at the other end. There's certainly a sliding scale. Some of you probably are working on things pushing towards the Figma end, but I'd bet the majority of us are certainly more towards my Falmouth Rangers team reports than we are towards building Figma. But what we did is we all worked and we all embraced this approach that big web apps were taking, and that meant bringing in lots of code. We had the browser and ultimately our users, but we put all sorts of stuff on top of it between us and them. We had our frameworks and maybe the dependencies of the frameworks. We have an additional library from npm. We have other stuff, and right at the top, we have our code. And I like to talk about this as dependencies, complexities, and abstractions. And what I want to focus on today is how I think we can reduce this verticality and get back to a slightly more straightforward website. But I was thinking about this, I was going through my slides after Amy's talk, and I thought that these kind of lines of different colorings looked like something, and I couldn't quite pick it out until I realized. I think we've created lasagna on the web. We've all heard of spaghetti code, but today I'm coining a new term that's going to take the web by storm. Amy will split the profits. I'm going for an architectural lasagna. That's my next step. So anyway, moving on from pasta and getting us all hungry again. And when we have this web and we keep adding dependencies and we keep building complexity, the two kind of marry up, and I think they make each other worse. As we have this combination, they just, by default, we end up just adding more because it's easy to add more. And as a result, as we've talked about, the UX has inevitably suffered. I don't think anyone set out to cause this. I'm not here to lay blame on anyone's door. I just think this was something that happened because the tools made it very easy and we all got very excited about all the things JavaScript could do, that we haven't yet stopped to reconsider what we should do now and if that is still the best way forwards. And similarly, I'm not here to tell you that we should never use JavaScript. That's not the goal here. JavaScript is a core part of the web, and it absolutely has its place. Depending on what you're working on and the features you need to build, you will probably need some JavaScript. I just think maybe the amount we're using has got a little skewed. Jeremy Keefe puts this well in this interview with Pixel Pioneers. The thing that's really bugged me for the past decade is the increasing complexity that's not driven by user needs. I think we pushed the complexity because it was enjoyable, it was fun, and it was satisfying to build these big applications. I just don't know if it's absolutely the thing we should keep on doing. And so to that end, I want to talk about two areas where I think we can improve and reflect upon. The first is complexity and abstractions, how we've allowed the applications and websites we build to get more complex and rely on more abstractions and dependencies. And then separately, I also want to talk about the actual impact of relying on these dependencies, how maybe we can consider them a bit more carefully and what we can do to mitigate the risks associated with it. So, who can remember Wednesday the 23rd of March 2016? So I'd be very impressed if anyone can tell me why that date in particular is relevant right now. Actually, I don't know if I would be impressed or just kind of confused as to how this would stick in your mind. Anyway, I think you will remember it. Wednesday the 23rd of March 2016 was the day that front-end internet broke forever. It was the day that the project LeftPad was removed overnight or all of a sudden from the NPM registry. This was an 11 lines of code tool is a strong word here, for a function that could pad a string with some additional characters. And it turned out that we weren't depending on it directly, but lots of the big tools that a lot of companies used were depending on it. I can remember this day because I worked at a startup where we had a big monolithic code base, so Python backend with lots of React on the front end, and we couldn't deploy the website because the npm install would fail. We can deploy our entire website, even if the change was nothing to do with JavaScript, because LeftPad had been removed from npm. And that was quite a stressful day. As I'm sure I'm probably not the only one who remembers this and sort of shudders a little bit. But that's the problem when we start building these complicated websites full of dependencies that we don't necessarily understand. Each one of these lumps of code or layers in the lasagna can cause you problems in the future. What if something you rely on becomes unmaintained on GitHub? Maybe that's not a problem right now. It could become a problem in the future. What if a tool has a security vulnerability that impacts your website, and so you need to either fix it or hope someone else fixes it for you? Or what if the way you're using a particular library triggers a certain performance case that causes a janky or bad user experience as your user scrolls up and down on your website? So each time we rely on some code, and that's both code that we have written ourselves along with code that we've installed from, say, npm, there is a chance anywhere that there could be a LeftPad-esque incident of some severity within that chunk. And so the more code we have, the more chunks we have, the higher the risk associated. It's not only the higher the risk, it's just the more work it is as a developer to maintain it and understand it. So the more code we ask our users to download and install. And as Michelle talked about earlier, there's a huge impact environmentally as well. Again, Jeremy, I'll just keep quoting him for the rest of this talk. Every dependency you add to a project is one more potential single point of failure. And what I think's happened is we've built these big websites and now we're beginning to see the pain points associated with them. I think everyone has loaded up a project that they worked on maybe 6 months ago, a year ago, whether it's at work or a side project, and been bemused by the errors you get because of the set of tools you used that now aren't quite playing nicely because something's broken, something's upgraded, or something's been deprecated. I think I yearn for a website stack that looks more like this. We have the code that we write, and then we are very carefully considered and critical about the dependencies and abstractions we rely on top of that. So how can we do this? How can we take these complicated stacks that build up our websites and instead reduce them down and be very considered about what code we ask our users to run? So there's a phrase, a 3-word phrase that I think has become overused and overloaded in conference talks. I don't know if anyone can guess it from this particular background. It's one I try to veer away from, but you've probably heard someone on stage talk about using the platform before. Yeah, I can hear some sort of laughing, but also shuddering in the seats. And I'm very much guilty of standing up on stages or writing blog posts talking about these great new features and that we should all use the browser because it's brilliant and we should all use the platform. But I think then if people took that message away and went home and looked at the particular feature, they would often get frustrated because it would be, oh, it's Chrome only, or it's only in Firefox right now, and it won't be implemented in other browsers for another year or 2 years, or maybe it never will. We don't really know. But what I've been noticing recently is that 3-4 years ago, these features that people were touting as a really good way to save installing extra dependencies, they are now supported well across all the platforms we need to. So I think people have become fatigued by the phrase use the platform because it was kind of code for use the latest version of Google Chrome and you'll be absolutely fine. But I think now it is not that, and there are many features that we can rely on that are supported very well across browsers. And this is a journey that I've been on myself personally as well. Prior to working at Google, I joined there 3 or so years ago. I worked at an e-commerce startup in London, and the front end was entirely React, and I was the lead developer of that front end. And I had a great time. I really liked it. I really enjoyed working with React. I felt productive with it. I was good at it. I could make what I felt were good website experiences for users who could afford to download all the required JavaScript. And I knew that joining the DevTools team meant that I wouldn't be working in a React world anymore. And that was actually quite scary because I'd spent the last 2, 3, 4 years building up this React-specific knowledge. I want to be clear that I'm not up here now to critique React. And if anyone doesn't work with React here, you can really swap React out for any large framework or sort of conceptually similar dependency that you might rely on. So I'm not about to start diving into all the things I dislike about any particular framework. And on DevTools, I knew that we'd be using a bespoke UI library that was written sort of 10, 15 years ago. It's been around a while. And I knew that we'd be transitioning into using custom elements. At this point, I'd not used them. I didn't really know too much about how they worked. And I was quite apprehensive, to be honest with you, about how much we could do and how much pain it would be to work with them compared to my React experience. And so what I started doing is I started a small side project where I tried to use these custom elements just to get a bit more familiarity with them. And I found that quite surprisingly to me is that I didn't actually miss a lot of the functionality that React was providing. I set out to build an HTML form where the obviously user inputs various data, hits submit, and stores it in a database somewhere. With my React hat on, I would have reached for one of the popular React form libraries, something like Redux, one of those type things. I would have made sure that every time the user typed in one of those input boxes, I would have run some code to update my state so the values stay in sync. And I've generally done quite a lot of work to replicate what is basically a form. So I set out to build this form without any JavaScript, or certainly as little JavaScript as I could get away with. It turns out there are loads of APIs now built into the browser that can get us a long way towards what we used to write JavaScript to achieve. Sure, a lot of you have seen the HTML form validation, lets you mark inputs as required, give them a min and max length, and perform pretty decent validations on them, all within the browser. If you need to read the data out into JavaScript for whatever reason, there's the form data API, which you give it a form and it will give you all the values back. So no need to track those yourself. And if you want to customize the messages the browser shows when a user has given you invalid input, you can do that as well using the constraint validation API. And I had barely used any of these APIs when I started on this little side project. But I found that by using them, I was able to build a functional form. It didn't miss out on anything because I wasn't using React. It worked without JavaScript, but I could use some of these APIs to layer on some additional functionality with JavaScript if I wanted to. And the browser support for all 3 of these is all in the very high 90s. And if I'd have been on stage a few years ago, I don't think I could have talked about these because all these APIs wouldn't have been in the high 90s. But I think now there are a lot of APIs that have matured and are supported across browsers that I think a lot of people just aren't really aware of. Another really good example of this where I was sort of ignorant to what the browser could do for me was when I needed to build an event emitter. I'm sure a lot of us have done this. You need something where you can add event listeners to objects and dispatch events and sort of have them talk to each other. And I would always install this from NPM or I would build it myself. So I joined Google and there I worked with a chap for a while called Paul Lewis. I'm sure some of you have probably met or come across or seen on the internet. I don't know, for those of you who haven't worked with Paul, he's got this really annoying habit where he's very smart and correct a lot of the time. It's very wearing, grinds on you quite a lot. Don't tell him I said that. You can see I don't follow him and that's why. But what Paul said to me is he said, well, Jack, I just use event target. And I said, Paul, what on earth is event target? It turns out that the browser has an event emitter built into it that's called event target. It's what is used whenever you listen to click events on any HTML element. But what you can do is you can take a class that you've written and you can have it extend the event target. And suddenly that gives you the ability to dispatch and listen to events. There's also a whole API for defining custom events as well, and you can send events with any data you want to. And this API has 97% coverage as well. So here we're still writing JavaScript. I'm not here to say that we should never write JavaScript, but where something like this, where we might reach for a dependency or an abstraction, we can actually achieve a lot with what the browser provides us out the box. So can we shift our default starting point away from a big JavaScript application and start with what the browser gives us? As Zach puts it in this blog post about single-page applications, you can't JavaScript your way out of an excess JavaScript problem. I think we need to be wary about writing more code to try and solve the problems that we've created by writing code in the first place. I think for a long number of years, it's been, I have a problem to solve, what dependency will solve this for me? This is really easy, as discussed. It's also very convenient, something Michelle touched upon earlier. And Pascal also, I think he wrote this blog post literally today or yesterday. The problem with conveniences is that they come at a cost. And we are now seeing that cost being paid by us as developers in how complex our websites have become, but by our users who are having to get through and download all that code. So can I have a problem to solve become, does the browser provide a solution for us natively? This may or may not require JavaScript. There's also, I'm far from an expert, but there's so much we can achieve now with HTML and CSS in particular, so we don't even have to reach for JavaScript anymore. If the browser does it natively, great, job's done. If not, okay, we're going to need to implement it or bring in a dependency. I'm going to come on into a bit about how we can be more considered in how we do that. Reducing the amount of JavaScript we ship is just good for everyone. It's good for our users, it's good for us, it's good for the environment. And I think we can do this by moving away from JavaScript by default. And we're already starting to see this happening out there in the wild with companies that are experimenting with other approaches to building websites. Katie at Etsy, I think, was the first one to term component islands, or what has become more generally the islands architecture. And Jason goes into more detail about the islands architecture in his blog post. The idea here, it's going to sound very much like we've jumped back 15 years in time, is that we have websites where we generate all the HTML on the server, gets sent down, but we leave these little pockets of interactivity that we can enhance on the client with JavaScript. That's using JavaScript for its purpose to enhance a web page without using it to build and run the whole ecosystem. So in Jason's talk, he gives this example that you can break a website down into parts, which you might have static content, you might have a JavaScript app, you might have static content that is then enhanced by JavaScript, but we're building multi-page apps backed by the server as default and embracing JavaScript for what it's good at. This is something colleague Jake does on his blog post as well. If you go to his blog, it's nearly all static, but you'll see little interactive examples as part of his blog posts. And as he puts it, he can enhance little parts of the page without going all in on a framework. So this islands architecture gets me really excited because it feels to me like the best of both worlds. Like we've swung far in one direction towards JavaScript and the pendulum is coming back into the middle with this architecture that embraces JavaScript for what it's good at and understands that we will need it at points in time, but doesn't use it as the default. So now I want to spend a bit of time talking about abstractions and dependencies. At some point, you are going to need to rely on someone's code, likely from NPM, for some feature on your website. Or you're going to need to have to build it yourself and define your own abstraction. Dependencies have a lot of convenience. They solve problems for us quickly, but they also have a cost associated with them. I think we need to get better at figuring out and considering that cost involved. So as Phil mentioned earlier today, I've got big into TikTok recently. Woo! I haven't actually, you can't follow me on there. And so I've been exploring other methods of viral marketing that we could use to really get this idea and this talk off the ground. So we've got the 4 easy methods you can use to manage your JavaScript. I've got the 4 ways you can manage your JavaScript and solve all your problems with the thread emoji, which I think is very important for these kind of things. And I even gave my hand at a YouTube thumbnail of me looking shocked, bemused, or confused. Excuse the font. I did this in a coffee shop as well. I thought it was very quiet. It was quite early in the morning. I didn't think anyone was looking at me as I took this photo on my webcam. I then looked up to see both the baristas staring straight at me. So I haven't been back there since. Anyway, I've got a few ideas about ways that we can consider and manage the dependencies we bring into our projects. I want to talk a bit about maintaining control, having an awareness of our dependencies, coming up again, leaning on the browser primitives, and finally, having an exit strategy. So let's talk first about maintaining control. When we write code, we can either be in control of it or we can cede control over to the code that we're relying on. So either our code is in control, or typically when we reach for a framework, the framework takes over and is in control. To give you a sort of practical example of what this looks like, If I'm the one writing code and I'm in control, I will change some data and then I will tell the code to do something, whether that's re-render, update, whatever it may be. If I'm working with a framework, what I will instead do is tell the framework that I've done something and it will do the rest for me. So in React world, you set some state. React will re-render, but you yourself are never going to tell React to re-render your website. React is just going to do it for you. So you are hooking into what the framework is doing. The framework is really controlling your website at this point in time. And this theory is known as the inversion of control. And this is actually a really good way to think about dependencies and the whole libraries versus framework debate. As Surma puts it in his blog post, also called The Cost of Convenience, a running theme, libraries and frameworks can be distinguished by looking at the inversion of control. If you're using a framework and you're hooking into its lifecycle, its way of working, its abstractions, then it is the one in control. If you're using a library, typically you tell it what to do. So in React world, or really any of these sort of component-based front-end frameworks, a component gets rendered, you use a framework primitive, such as a setState call, which tells React that you've changed some data, and React decides that we want to re-render. Oh, I'm one side off. There we go. One more tick. 99% of the time, when you're using a framework, this will work just fine. You have your components, you change your data, the framework takes care of everything for you. The challenge with leaning on such big frameworks is what happens when you need to swerve this for a minute? What happens when you hit that 1% case where you need to do something differently? What happens when you have that 10-year-old jQuery component that you have to keep using for whatever reason? Does the framework let you sort of step to one side and deal with something outside of that framework's architecture? Or as Surma puts it, as frameworks often put themselves at the core of any architecture, it can be hard to opt out. A framework that lets you do this will have what Surma calls an escape hatch, what I would call an off-ramp. An escape hatch is a way for you to jump out of the framework's zone of control and run some code yourself. If you are going to rely on a framework, it's very important to think about how you can do that. What is the escape hatch? Prior to Google, the company I worked at, we used to support people could order clothes on our website. We used to support shipping via Collect Plus, which for those not UK based is like a sort of courier service. It will get delivered to a post office or something and you go and pick it up. Now, Collect Plus provided us a widget for like sort of the user filling in their address and ordering and stuff. It was a widget written about 15 years ago with jQuery 1 point something, and it barely worked and you couldn't touch it because it would break immediately. So we needed, despite the fact that we built this whole checkout flow in React, we needed a way to be able to push that very old, very fragile jQuery code into the framework. And React does let you do this, but it certainly was a bit of a challenge at points. So when we talk about libraries versus frameworks, I'm here to suggest that libraries are normally a better option, because a library really is that escape hatch or off-ramp by default, because it doesn't try to take over the world. It doesn't try to own your entire website's rendering lifecycle and how it updates. You never give up control, so it's much easier to stay flexible and change if you need to. So when we think about dependencies that we're going to rely on, think about if you're ceding that control. Are you letting the framework become the architect of your whole website, or are you still the one in control? So next I want to talk about dependency awareness. As we discussed, it's convenient to use our tools to install dependencies. But dependencies aren't free, and they have various costs associated with them. They're more code, fundamentally, in our bundle. They're another point of failure, as discussed. They're another thing that you have to upgrade or completely ignore, up to you, on a semi-regular basis. And they're also just more code and complexity to understand. And there are more costs associated. These are sort of the first four that came to mind. But if we're going to rely on these dependencies, they must justify the costs that they have. And we must look as developers to mitigate the risks. So again, I've got some thoughts about how we solve this. So I've written Jack's ultimate guide to dependency consideration. Special offer today, all credit cards accepted. Please come and see me afterwards. So when we think about dependencies and using them in our websites, I want you to ask a lot of what questions. What is the dependency providing? Probably the core question. How much good is it giving me? Like, what is it saving me? What is the impact on the bundle size? Is it large or small? And does the amount of functionality you're going to benefit sort of make it worth that size that you're paying? What would it be like to build it ourselves? I see a lot of people reach for an off-the-shelf dependency thinking, oh, we can never build that from scratch. But actually, because if you build it from scratch, you can build it specifically to your exact use case. It's often much easier than you might think. What do we do if it becomes unmaintained? Is that going to cause us a problem? Do we feel comfortable with that? Are we uncomfortable and need to think about what would happen? And finally, what if we have to replace it? What if something goes really wrong and we just have to replace it? Is that going to be hard? Is it going to take up a lot of engineering time? To give you a couple of examples of sort of thinking these through practically, we had a couple of examples on the DevTools team about dependencies that we considered. So when we were looking at using web components, we were really toying between a library and a framework to do this work for us. So there's a framework called LitElement, which really, if you saw it, it looks React-esque, but it's built on top of web components. That's really a very short, not entirely accurate description, but it should give you enough idea. And lit-HTML is part of that. There's just a small library that lets you re-render HTML efficiently in the page. So we debated about the pros and cons of these. And eventually we reached just for lit-HTML. It provided us less functionality out of the box, but we weren't sure if we needed the additional functionality the LitElement provided us. We also figured it was easier to start with the smaller library, and we could always upgrade, if you like, into LitElement, than it would be to go with LitElement, realize it gave us far too much power that we didn't need, and then try to downgrade or remove it in favor of lit-HTML. But an example where we did pick the dependency, and we still maintain that to this day, is the text editor that's in DevTools. So if you go into the sources panel, if you edit any of the text, you're using CodeMirror there to do that. I've never tried to build a text editor. I don't know if anyone in here has, but they're pretty complicated and they're very heavy and there's lots going on in there. We could have built this in-house to save that dependency, but this would have taken many engineers, many months, if not years, to get close to the level of features that CodeMirror provides for us. So in this case, although CodeMirror is quite a large dependency to add, it is absolutely worth it for us because it lets us focus on other problems. I think we can also do a lot more to be aware of the literal size that we are adding to our bundles. I've got a slightly controversial idea for dealing with this, so I do genuinely need you to just calm down and not jump to any conclusions too quickly. Because I think we should check our node modules folder into Git and stop Git ignoring them. And people will think that's a really dreadful idea, and that's fine. I'm not suggesting you all go to work tomorrow and do this. I would like to know how it goes if you do. I wrote a blog post about this, which you can see linked below. And the reason I came across this is because it's what we do at work on the DevTools codebase. I'd never seen it before. But it has a lot of surprising benefits. There's no more npm install ever, apart from when you install a dependency or upgrade it for the first time. That's locally and on any bots that run or deploy your code. Every build is 100% reproducible because you've all got all the code. Sure, you can solve this with npm's lock files, but you just don't need to if you don't even need to run npm install. If the npm goes down or left pad gets removed from npm, there's no blocked builds because you don't rely on npm. Dependencies of dependencies, also known as transitive dependencies, become very visible. We've all installed something, thought it was a very small package to add, but realized it reaches out to 10 different things that it's now installed to come along with it. If you install a dependency that does that, it becomes very obvious very quickly. You are forced to see the impact of the code that you are committing. You literally, in the diff on your pull request, you see all those lines that you are adding. I found that kind of helps consider if it's worth it. And finally, if you were to update a version of something, and let's say some malicious code has crept in because the author's GitHub account has been hacked, you will see that straight away and you can spot it. And of course, we learned earlier from Michelle that there are other benefits to this approach. There's no more energy used from npm installs, as that developer who wanted to build the CO2 npm emitter noted. So I've no idea on the costs that we're saving by doing this, but if you think there are at least 30 or so engineers probably generating hundreds, if not thousands of builds every day, that adds up to a lot of time that we don't have to wait for npm to run. So if you do want to do this or you want to explore it, I would encourage you to give it a go on a side project. But if you want to incrementally get there, you can do this as well. So if you go into your git ignore file, you might have a line that looks like node modules/star, which tells Git to ignore everything in that directory. But you can then take a line with a particular dependency and put a bang in front of it, and that will tell Git that you do want to pay attention to that folder. So you can slowly start beginning to commit dependencies if you don't want to jump in at the deep end, which I fully understand. I do have to give you a warning, though. This approach may make you unpopular on the internet. I've removed the person's name, but I did want to show you one of the tweets I got at the time of writing this blog post. It fucks me up. We DevOps do our best to advocate for good tools, and there's a dude coming from Google, and I want to fucking cry, was one of the tweets I got. So I don't think that person has adopted this approach yet, but I haven't actually asked since. Yeah, I did enjoy that one. So we can be more aware of our dependencies. We can weigh up the costs and benefits of the dependency and try and make those costs visible. I've already talked a little bit about using the platform, but I think we can do more here to lean on browser primitives. And in particular, I'm here to give a big +1 to web components. Well, thank you, someone. And particularly web components when we think about how they work within that context of the islands architecture. If you think about this architecture as little pockets of JavaScript functionality in a multi-page application, we really are describing web components there. I think they're a very natural fit. And we're starting to see frameworks like Lit, there's Stencil, there's a few others that are now building on top of web components rather than reinventing that part of the stack. And that's really exciting to me because if you pick one of these large frameworks, your code that you ship to your users cannot ever be smaller than whatever that framework's bundle size is. But if you pick a framework that is leaning on top of web components, then suddenly we have moved that part of the dependency into the browser, and the user now has to run less stuff to get it. So the frameworks we use can become much smaller because they build on top of what the browser gives us, rather than having to re-implement this from scratch. Another example of this is there's a new API coming to the browsers, I've no idea when, called the Scheduling API. For people building websites, it's probably not going to be that interesting. But for people building frameworks where you have lots of re-renders and you need to batch those and schedule them, this new API can become something that they use rather than implement it themselves from scratch. And to some extent, browsers will always be playing catch-up with React, Vue, Angular, and the like. And that's really by design. The web has to move slower than these frameworks because as we land features into the web platform, they have to be stable, they have to stay around for a long time, and we cannot make breaking changes to them. So when I talk about web components, people will reel off, well, they don't do this, and they don't do this, and they don't do this. And that's absolutely fair enough. They don't do everything. They don't give you out the box what something like React will give you. What's exciting to me is I think in time, and we're starting to be in that timeline now, they will. So I'm not going to go into the details here, and this is one spec that is cutting edge. I'm not here to say that you should all use it, just here to observe that it's exciting that in time we will be able to use it. It's a spec called the Declarative Shadow DOM, and it looks to address the fact that web components and server-side generated content don't really play well nicely together at the moment. In the future, it's going to be easier to have web components where their content begins on the server and then is enhanced on the client. So if you are interested in that, I'd really recommend this blog post. I believe it is in Safari and Chrome, and Mozilla have said they are working on it. So we're not talking a million years off here, but it's a very exciting sort of step in the right direction. And I'm sure over time there'll be more specs like this to look to fill in the holes that so we can make web components even more viable. So I think this islands architecture with web components and a few tweaks such as the Declarative Shadow DOM is a really exciting place to be in, to address that imbalance and bring us back into the middle of the pendulum. Something that Zach Lee observes in his blog post on single-page apps, in particular, is recognizing this, that features of frameworks often fade into irrelevance as the web platform progresses. We've seen this happen. The most obvious example is jQuery and its its dollar function that took any CSS selector as a string and gave you those elements back. That now exists on the platform in the form of query selector and query selector all. So it's very exciting to me if we think about all the things frameworks have experimented with. Some of them haven't worked, but some of them have. That I think the browser in time will be able to catch up to those and consider how we can take the best of all that and have it built in for us out the box. This also just makes our jobs easier, increases the longevity of our websites if we lean on what the browser provides. There are fewer things that are suddenly going to change. There's less code to manage generally. So browsers are getting more powerful. The primitives that we're working with are here to stay. And by leaning on abstractions that build on top of those primitives, we can avoid shipping as much code to our users. And my final strategy is to have an exit strategy. Always think of the worst case, or be a pessimist, if you like, or British. I don't mean having parties in Downing Street during lockdowns. I just mean being aware of what might happen if a dependency suddenly disappears from the internet. If you think about the timeline of the web, in particular JavaScript frameworks, 10, maybe 15 years ago, maybe 10, we were looking at Knockout and Backbone. Angular 1 and the object.observe sort of proposal happened. Then we had React and Vue. The exact ordering of these is not entirely scientifically accurate, I should point out. Then we had React hooks and things like Svelte. Now I'm here talking about web components, lit, stencil, islands architectures. Who knows what is next? And so the pessimistic view is what happens if this all goes wrong? But I like to think of another way as well, is what can we do today to make things better for the developers of the future? What can present Jack do to make future Jack, or Jack's dad, happy? My dad is also called Benjamin Franklin, which he hates, by the way, just as an aside. That's not even a joke, genuinely his name. I don't think my grandparents have quite realized what they did. Obviously, you cannot future-proof everything. Code changes, requirements change, browsers change. But I think if we think about what can we do now to make things easier in the future, leaning into the browser is one very clear way that we can make improvements in that area. So those are my strategies for managing dependencies. So I want to end by reflecting on the path to what I think is a less complex web. As discussed, we can reduce complexity by leaning into the browser, what it provides. Doing so reduces the amount of code we have to ship. It reduces the energy usage, as we've heard earlier today. Reduces user frustrations by making things hopefully smoother, less code to download, quicker on mobile devices, bad connections, and so on. Increases accessibility because loads of things that the browser gives us are accessible by default. As Jason notes in his blog post on the islands architecture, a website that uses standard HTML is easier for assistive technologies and web crawlers, and it makes the default outcome the accessible one. And it's a really good blog post I encourage you to read, and talks about how if we just lean on this stuff, things are accessible without us having to really go and put the extra mile in and reinvent things that the browser can provide for us. And also, for those of us who like working with and do work with frameworks, we can't just start new projects every single day. Leaning on the browser does not mean the end for frameworks. As discussed, I hope that in time, more of these internals that frameworks currently ship themselves will instead be able to lean on primitives that the browser has built in, and so we can ship less code. That said, I feel with pretty strong conviction that reducing our reliance on frameworks and preferring libraries where we keep control is a better path towards maintainable websites where we can react to changes in the future too. And we should always be thinking about the off-ramp and staying flexible to things changing over time. As Surma notes in his blog post, if you've outgrown a framework or it's not working for you anymore, it can be very hard to move away from that framework because they take over your entire architecture. I think we can be more critical about considering the dependencies and understanding that there are costs and trade-offs involved with every piece of code we add to our website. And we can be aware of what we are shipping. That's not to say we can't embrace and be grateful that we have tools that let us install and manage dependencies really easily, but we shouldn't let that hide what's going on behind the scenes. I think hopefully we can shrink this into a much smaller, more compact web. And if we do that, I think the user experience will improve. But what's exciting is we look at all these tools available and we look at things like the islands architecture, and there are frameworks now or applications beginning to build on top of that. I think Eleventy has a plugin for it. There's Astro as well, and I'm sure there'll be more to come. Is that I think the developer experience can stay high. I don't think we have to trade these off. Clearly, if we do, we should focus on the user. But I think we're coming to a place where we can swing back into the middle of that pendulum and really have a great developer experience, but most importantly, a great user experience. So I'll finish there. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for having me. You can find the slides and all the information there, and please come and grab me if you fancy a chat later on. Thank you.